Hello, folks. I have big news about Star Wars Universe Podcast, letting everyone know that we're going to be coming off of hiatus and back to regular episodes at the beginning of December. We're also going to be making some big changes. I'm bringing on a couple of new people as guests. We may be changing the name of the podcast and just kind of giving it a little bit of a different spin. The same kind of content we've been giving you, but bringing in some new perspectives and using that to shape things in a little bit of a different way. We're going to be finishing up the Clone Wars. We're going to be finishing up Rebels. Riki and I are recording on that as we speak. We have a lot of other great content. For the moment, with the strike going on, we're going to focus primarily on the animated content, but there are a lot of other good things we can bring to you, and even more once the strike ends. So thank you so much for being a fan. Thank you so much for subscribing. Of course, please remember that you can become a member for only $5 a month. I think it's $55 a year. You can... And of course, remember, you can sign up for, and of course, you can become a member, $5 a month, or you can sign up for 1 year in total and save $5 for $55. And that means you get ad-free content, you get the bonus content, and most importantly, you get to help support this podcast. It's a lot of work putting it all together. There's a lot of money involved in terms of website hosting and all that kind of stuff. Just anything that you can do to help support this, it really helps me and everyone else know that you care about this podcast, that you want to still keep it coming. So whether or not you are a member, of course, you're still going to get access to great episodes. For the next couple weeks, we're going to be running back some of our older episodes, some old favorites. Stick around for those, and remember that the first week of December, new episodes are coming. Thank you so much. We have spoken. Hello, and welcome to the Star Wars Universe Podcast Book Club, where we're talking about Darth Plagueis. Who is Palpatine, and how did he come to be part of the Sith? Why did Dooku turn his back on the Republic and on the Jedi? Who was Darth Plagueis, and what role did he have in the creation of Anakin Skywalker? We'll be looking at all these questions and more right after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. My name is Matthew. I'm your host. Once again, I'm joined for this episode of the Book Club by Brian V. Klein. Brian, how are we doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. This is one of my favorite of the Star Wars books. I'm really excited for us to jump into it. I'm also excited because, Brian, you and I have a great conversation, but one thing these last couple episodes I've done have really taught me is that, especially when we're doing this episode for people who, some of you may have read the book and loved it, some of you may have not read the book and just want to learn more about it and learn more about this part of the universe, it's really helpful for us to have someone on the podcast who hasn't read the book and can help be that voice of, asking the questions and being with us on this journey as we explore what the book has to teach us about Star Wars in general. So, playing that role today is going to be Paul Hoppe, a regular co-host on this and other podcasts I do. Paul, how are we doing today?
Oh, passable. I'm ready to be the agent of chaos, or the the one to keep you honest in terms of making sure that you're actually explaining what happens in a way that those of us who haven't read any Star Wars novels, or this particular one, can follow along.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that'll be good because, as I said, the goal with these podcasts is if more people read the books, great, because I think these are very enjoyable books. But more than anything, I love learning about these books for what they teach us about the larger canon. And I think it's totally cool if people want to, they're not up for reading the book, but they want to listen to this podcast instead. Awesome, because there's just so much more that it introduces you to. Now, as part of that, I do want to frame by saying, and Brian, I wonder if this is what you were about to jump in to say, because it's what I'm sure a lot of listeners are about already halfway through writing an angry tweet about. The book we're talking about today, Darth Plagueis, is not officially part of the Star Wars canon.
Correct.
It is part of the Star Wars Legends group. But we talked before about how the Legends are all of these books that were written before 2014, that as part of Disney acquiring Star Wars and kind of restarting it with Force Awakens, they said, you know what, we're no longer going to hold that all those are canon. But one thing that's happened over the last couple of years is that more and more, we are seeing that the ideas of some of those books are seeping in more and more. And we talked about for this book club that we are going to bring in some of those non-canon books, especially ones where, there's no other existing canon that contradicts it, because it still gives us the closest thing to canon we have about some of these stories, and certainly is likely things that are probably going to be inspiring or connected to the stories we get going forward. So, for me, I think that's why it's important to talk about this book especially because it is so foundational to Sidious and where he comes from, and just filling in a lot of the gaps that we have leading into the Clone Wars movies. And so, Brian, for you, where do you kind of stand on that in terms of like where this book falls in terms of being canon or legends, and how it informs the rest of Star Wars for you?
Well, seeing as how when this came out, it was almost like decreed as being canon, because until something comes around to, negate this is pretty much the way that you would think it would go. Because, the story is so in depth with a lot of the details, especially with the way that it mirrors and leads into the prequels. So, if they don't ever touch anything with this, then this is fine because the book is so good and the characters develop and it is excellent.
Very true. Very true. And Paul, where are you coming from as we start this conversation? What do you know about this book going into what we're talking about today?
I've heard a decent amount of what sort of goes on in it. I have a friend who I lived with in Germany for a couple months, actually, who's super into all things Sith. And I think Darth Bane is more like his jam, but he talked about this book, and so I got kind of an idea of that, from him. And then I've also watched some YouTube videos. Like during The Mandalorian, I ended up just watching a whole bunch of Star Wars YouTube videos. So, I know what happens to him,
right.
and some of the major plot points, but I certainly don't know, the majority of details as things go along.
Right. And just to give, we'll give a plot summary in a few minutes, but just to give the quick overview for those who have no idea what we're talking about so far, the best way to ground it is that if you remember in Revenge of the Sith, Sidious is talking to Anakin and he says, "Do you know the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise?" And he tells the story about this older Sith Lord who was trying to learn how to conquer death and may have even come very close, but then was, of course, killed by his apprentice in his sleep. Darth Plagueis is the book about that person, Darth Plagueis, hence the name. And what the book tells us is that he was actually Sidious's master himself. And so it's the story not only of this Sith Lord who experienced and explored the role of life and death and the Force, but it also winds up being the story of how Sidious becomes a Sith Lord, how Palpatine becomes Sidious. And so it also gives us about 40 years of backstory about the Sith machinations that lead up to the events of the Phantom Menace. And so it also fills in a lot of the gaps of, who was Count Dooku and why, helping to explain his role and all the stuff leading up to the fight on Naboo with the Trade Federation and things like that. So and for you, Brian, when you think of this book, obviously it's a great book, but why does it matter? How does it help inform you and your understanding of this part of the this part of the Star Wars universe?
Well, first off, this book originally was supposed to come out in late 2008. It was on the schedule at Del Rey, and that was a lot closer to the end of Revenge of the Sith. So that's that line when he talks about Darth Plagueis the Wise, it was still on people's minds, and then it got pushed back. So it didn't end up coming out until January of 2012. So that was almost 3.5 years later. But the story itself, it's basically, the story is broken up into 3 parts, which are 3 time periods and 3 distinct things. And once you get to the third part of it, you can see everything walking its way into how it ties into the Phantom Menace. But even before that, the stuff going into, they do really well with bringing in characters that we learn later on in the story, but we have been introduced to before, like some of the Imperial dignitaries from Return of the Jedi and some other characters that were in like Timothy Zahn's books. And so you see how these characters originally got involved in the galaxy far, far away, and it's interesting like that. And James Luceno has always been good with being able to take characters or ideas that you really don't have any backstory on and make them completely interesting once he starts, getting into the meat of it.
Yeah, it feels like in a lot of ways what I think I like most about the book is it feels like it's written by someone who watched the prequels and then listened either to himself or to other people saying wait a minute, why does Count Dooku feel this way? Why do why does the Trade Federation care about what's happening on Naboo? Where does this Maul guy come from? And says to themselves, okay, let me write a book to explain those things. Because it really, this book especially, I feel like, and it's part of why I know it's not officially the canon, but it also is sort of it's in that kind of nebulous place of it's there's nothing that's been written that contradicts it, and it's certainly a lot of it is being found more and more into the canon. Mm-hmm. It feels like it really helps to at least give a version of it that's a lot better than what we got originally, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, especially because the first thing you see when the crawl for the Phantom Menace pops is the trade routes have been taxed, the taxation of trade routes. And when you're watching that originally back in 99, I'm like, what? But how is that Star Wars? And then you realize in this book it explains it, and then you go, oh, it's this third step in a 3-step process, and it actually makes it pretty interesting. I mean, if taxation of trade routes can be interesting, this book helps.
Hey, listen, some of us economics geeks, we always want that kind of stuff. But so Brian, let me put you on the spot the way I like to do with these. Can you give a plot summary? We don't need every detail, but give us the rough outline of what happens in this book.
Okay. So like
By the way, spoilers, Sidious kills him.
Oh, I was going to read the book. And, actually, if I could just interject one thing.
Please do.
So as somebody who's, not enjoyed all the movies, but enjoyed at least parts of all of them, and, loved the original trilogy and a lot of, the animated series and of course, Mandalorian. I'd say that the only Sith that ever seemed really compelling to me as a character was Vader. Mm-hmm. And so I guess my hope from these books would be that they make, Dooku kind of just seems like some guy who's evil and apparently wasn't, but that's just briefly referenced, right? And Sidious seems like the, as I think you would say, the mustache twirliest mush-to-wash twirler who ever twirled a mustache. And their names are all Bane and Tenebris and, Plagueis and Sidious and Tyrannus,
Venomous,
and Dad. I don't know. But, but I would hope that these books kind of make them more characters than sort of cartoonish villains that they can sometimes be, or maybe not cartoonish as much as just sort of one note.
Two-dimensional, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And I would, Brian, before we get into the plot summary, I would curious your reaction to that as well. I think part of why I like this book so much as it does, and frankly, I'd say that the character it does it the most for me is Count Dooku. Oh, okay. And we'll talk about the specifics of that. I feel like one of the reasons why the prequels fail so thoroughly for me is that I just have no idea what the Separatists want or what Dooku wants.
Yeah.
And I feel like this book, because the perspective that you get is of Sidious and Plagueis slowly corrupting Dooku. And seeing who he is as a Jedi and why he's dissatisfied, both as a member of the Republic and a member of the Jedi, to me is far and away one of the most compelling parts of the book.
Cool. Well, what happens then?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was trying to set it back up.
There you go.
So, like we said, the book takes place. There's a 35-year span, 67 to 32 BBY, and the first part of it starts off with Higo Damask, who is the actual name of Darth Plagueis. Him and his master, Darth Tenebris, are on a planet looking for Cartosis, which is Lake Beskar, back before Beskar was really introduced. And they're on the planet. They're mining it. A pocket of gas explodes, the cavern collapses, and Plagueis sees this as an opportunity to take out his master, and basically he guides a boulder to fall and kill him. And so that's basically what happens there. Plagueis goes about doing his stuff because he's if you don't know what a Mun is, it's one of the banking clan people from the prequels, which are they got the tall, not cylindrical, but long, narrow heads, so that if you can imagine what that looks like. So then he finds out that Tenebris had another student called Darth Venomous, who he ends up basically fighting and putting him in a coma because Darth Plagueis' main goal is to A, bring down to the rule of 2, bring back the Sith, and also learn how to cheat death. So that's what he starts doing there. As his dealings, because he's the Magistar of the banking clan, takes them to Naboo to help them with they found some plasma or something, but when he was at Naboo, he senses Palpatine, and he befriends him, and he starts manipulating Palpatine, and gets Palpatine to kill his parents, and crash the spaceship and stuff like that, and then Plagueis takes Palpatine on as his apprentice. So then we jump 10 years, and then Palpatine is go through his training, and at the same time he's climbing the political ladder. In order to learn more about the Sith that Plagueis isn't teaching him, he goes to Dathomir, where Zabrak, or a Dathomirian woman, gives him an infant Zabrak, whose name is Maul, who ends up becoming Darth Maul. So he sends him to Mustafar to train. Plagueis is looking more into the cloning to figure out how to, basically... there's so much machinations between the stuff you sort of see in the prequels with the banking clans and the Trade Federation and the Techno Union and all this. So he goes to Kamino to get that part set up. Plagueis gets maimed in an attack, and then that's the end of the second act. And in the third act, it's 2 decades later. It's pretty much like 2 years before the Phantom Menace. Palpatine befriends Dooku at some... I forgot what there's a lot of the characters from the prequels come into it, and there's also Jedi Sifo Dyas is there, who Plagueis pretty much convinces him that the Republic is falling, and he sends Sifo Dyas to Kamino to procure the clone army in the name of the Jedi, but paid for by Plagueis and the banking clan. And this is about the time in the book where it starts lining up with the Phantom Menace, with Padme getting elected queen, and they learn of Anakin, who... from the time frame of it, that's when they realize it's like, oh crap, was this created by Plagueis, or was this created by the Force as a response to Plagueis trying to create life by the Force? And then, anyways, it crescends with Palpatine killing Plagueis right when he got elected Chancellor, and then the last scene is him sitting down with Anakin and Dooku, pretty much laying out the plans of the rest of the prequels.
Right, and a couple of the key points here, I think, and we'll go more into each one of these characters. And Paul, I'm sure this may be incredibly confusing, so ask any questions you have on behalf of the audience. But a couple of the key points here is, one is that we get Palpatine is basically the sort of like frustrated son of nobility who has these abilities of the Force. No one quite understands it. Everyone's afraid of him. It's very much kind of like, the young mutant from X-Men or whatever it is, like the person with powers.
But the Jedi haven't come to grab him or something.
Right, because because he's quite good at hiding them,
okay.
And he and part of it is that the Jedi are fading in their ability to find these things. Is that one of the ideas of the story? And so that he is that kind of like the frustrated child of nobility who has all the sense of entitlement, and Plagueis is able to fix on that and to push that forward. And then with Dooku, the story is that one of the things that we get, and again, it's kind of this through second and third hand. But the idea that as the Republic is having more and more trouble, in part because there's all this political machinations, as he was saying, out on the rim, among planets like the Trade Federation and the Banking Clan and the Techno Union, and the Jedi are being sent more and more into situations where they really aren't trained to deal with them. And Jedi are being killed because of it. Mm-hmm. And including some Jedi who Dooku cared quite a bit about.
Yeah, one of his old Padawans.
Right. And so Dooku is seeing Jedi be killed because of the failures of the Republic. He's seeing the Republic interfere with planets that he thinks they shouldn't be interfering with. He's feeling like the Jedi are not using their power the way that they should. And then there's just this wonderful set of conversations over the course of the book between Palpatine and Dooku of just Palpatine slowly, in the same way you see in Revenge of the Sith, between him and Anakin, slowly baiting the hook and slowly encouraging him. And the moments where nothing could have been done, but if only, till by the end, Dooku is sort of out, speculating like maybe there are some things the dark side can teach us the Jedi won't allow, and I'm leaving the Jedi to explore that. And even in the book, you can sort of see the wheels in Sidious's head being like, and he says something like, I think eventually you will find your way to a dark side practitioner. Of course he's sitting right there.
Right.
Yeah, that was.
Dooku doesn't know that Sidious is Sidious. He's talking to Palpatine in his eyes.
Oh, yeah, correct.
I think by the very end, You could imply that Dooku is starting to suspect.
Sure.
And that they're both kind of starting to dance slowly towards, it's that kind of like, I'll show you yours if you show me mine. Yeah.
The seed was definitely planted with their last conversation where Dooku tells him that he's leaving the Order and the whole Sith thing, and he doesn't quite tell him, but he's like, well, yeah, like you said, one day you'll meet him, and just because he wants to learn the ideology because it fits more in line with what he figures he wants to do to get the galaxy back to the way it was, instead of this dogmatic view that the Jedi are taking.
Right.
But what does that look like in terms of the sort of galaxy being the way he wants it? Is that like clear? Like, is that sort of what the separatist thing is about?
It is somewhat. I think one part of it is like no longer using the Jedi to interfere with things. One part of it is there is an element of, I just want someone to make the trains run on time.
Mm-hmm.
And here's again where the Sith plot becomes so ingenious, because what as Brian mentioned, Plagueis is, in charge of these large financial institutions, and they're doing a lot to basically buy senators, and there's incredible corruption in the Republic. And that's a big part of what Dooku was so frustrated by. Okay. That democracy is, in many ways, it's written some years ago, but it very much predicates sort of the Tea Party kind of rhetoric and things like that, of people being, having very legitimate frustrations about, governments being controlled by economic forces, and thus thinking like if only some strong person was in charge and things like that.
Right, because that'll fix the problem of too many people having too much power.
Oh, yeah.
Or too few people having too much power. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and I think part of what Dooku does is there is this idea of like, but if only the enlightened ones were in charge,
Sure,
and he does definitely seem to have that kind of idea.
They basically want to break it down and then build it back up from scratch in the way it used to be, which like to them it's Republic, like, kind of. Yeah, even like because they really don't explain that, because it's sort of, you don't know what it used to be, but it's basically there's so much corruption and manipulation that they see, but it's mainly done by the main guys. It's like Plagueis and Sidious are doing most of it. They're playing people against themselves. They're like you saw in the prequels, it ends up being two sides fighting against each other, run by the same side for a common goal, which at the end it makes the people that the big bad look like the Empire is now the savior of the galaxy, when no, that was what they wanted the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It explains all that, why that came to fruition and how long it had been planned, and just the minutia of the details to get there was actually pretty fascinating.
One thing I think is also an important part is that obviously he's Count Dooku at the time that we know him.
Right.
As a Jedi, he is just Jedi Master Dooku. But the idea is that he chose to give up his ability to, he gave up his hereditary claim to the Count. What's the name of the planet that he's from? It's with
Sereno.
Sereno, yeah. He's supposed to be the Count of Sereno. He gives up his hereditary claim. And so part of the temptation that he has is to go and take back that power.
Right.
And I think that's one other interesting part of his character, is that he has this family claim and a family line that he never really lets go of. So I was going to say is we could sort of switch into going kind of character by character. And I think Dooku is one of the first ones. And since we're already kind of pretty deep on Dooku, let's just kind of keep pushing there.
Deep Dooku?
Oh, God.
But so he's got this tension between, like, political power and, like, Jedi power, kind of. It almost, to me, like, sounds sort of like Leia in the sequel trilogy.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of having that decision to make between, like, wanting to be a Jedi or wanting to be a political figure. Does that kind of...
Dooku basically thinks that the Jedi are being misused by the Jedi Council to be the enforcers of the whole Republic, which you see more in the prequels. I mean, they even get to the points where they're doing the re-election campaigns, which they deal with a bit in the Phantom Menace. And whenever they show Chancellor Valorum, they always mention that there's Yoda with him and there's Mace Windu with him, and the Jedi are always with the Chancellor, which makes it look even worse that yes, these Jedi are pretty much like the political, enforcers that they shouldn't be, but that was put there through the manipulations of Plagueis and Insidious.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. I think the connection you make to Leia is a good one, and that's one that I actually really want us to explore when we look at those later movies of Leia kind of making this conscious decision, at least as I understood it, not to focus on being a Jedi as much as to focus on the political and the military side. I think Dooku is really a purist in a lot of ways, and some of those interesting conversations in the book also are where Sidious, Dooku, and Qui-Gon Jinn are all talking, because not as much, but we also learn a bit more about Qui-Gon Jinn and how he was very much also kind of a rebel, and he's someone who we learn more about as well in some of the other books that are very clearly referenced in this. Brian, can you talk a little bit more about Qui-Gon Jinn and sort of what this book shows us about him and where he stands in all these kind of questions we're talking about?
To me, I think Qui-Gon pretty much just solidified like the character you see in the movie, where he has with the living force being the thing that encapsulates everything, is still kind of very not looked down upon by the Jedi, because I think Dooku even says that when they're talking about Qui-Gon, and he's like, he's still, what he wants to do is this, but what he actually is thinking of doing is with the living force. And so, but I think for as much as he was in there.
Paul, what were you going to ask?
What's that, like, what's the distinction between the living force and whatever else they would be doing?
The living force is sort of like his viewpoint he had like in the Phantom Menace, where, everything's in motion. You can control everything around you if you have the ability to do it, and everything works in concert with each other. Whereas like the unifying force is almost like the whole the prophecy, and those guys lean too much on stuff that was predicted before, and that it's sort of your destiny is already set for you. And
I think one of the ideas of the living force is that it almost has not necessarily a sentience of its own, but kind of a will. And the idea of like that it's something you can, Qui-Gon seems, this whole idea of that the child was brought to him and that he's meant to train the child and things like that. One thing that the book kind of goes into, and it's interesting, apparently some other versions of the book originally would have, and then were left on the cutting room floor, but is kind of putting a mirror of Plagueis, who's trying very hard to learn how to use the Force to extend life, and Qui-Gon, who's in his own way, in a much more mystical way, also trying to understand how to use the Force to exist beyond death. And that the ability of Obi-Wan to come back and, basically to Force Ghost is things that Qui-Gon basically discovers how to Force Ghost because he's exploring this idea of the living Force.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And if they hadn't had that be a plot point here, then it would be like, why aren't there like 100,000 like Force Ghost Jedi all the time roaming around?
Exactly, yeah. It's that idea of why this is kind of a new thing the Jedi can do.
Okay.
They had some of that in a deleted scene from Revenge of the Sith where Yoda talks to Obi-Wan on the ship after giving, when they talk about on the blockade runner, where he's like, I got a lesson for you to do. And I've learned to commute with an old student. But other than that, it's just sort of like how it became about. And then all of a sudden by, the sequels, they're all over the place.
Right. And I think in Clone Wars, we do see Yoda.
Yeah, that's referenced.
Yeah, right. It's Yoda learns from Qui-Gon Jinn. Qui-Gon Jinn talks to him in that way.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that's important is also, it's much more about Dooku, but Sifo Dyas is mentioned a little bit here as well. And that he especially is very upset about the death of the Jedi. And so I think that also helps to understand a little more why Sifo Dyas might have been the one who was okay with the creation of the army. Because Sifo Dyas, like Dooku, like both of them, but especially Sifo Dyas, is really into the idea of like, it's almost kind of the police need to be more militarized kind of a thing. There's very much of that, like, we're dying, the people don't have the respect for us they used to do, we need to be ready to fight back.
Right, because they even mentioned a couple of times that the Jedi don't number the amount that everyone thinks there is, that they can be an army of themselves. You know, you can't send 2 Jedi to a planet and expect them to defend against, 100 spaceships. Yeah. But if you had an army, but that goes against some accord that they made where the Republic can't have their own army, but these planets that end up becoming part of the Separatists start becoming militarized and creating their own army. And I think at one point they were saying that the Chancellor was hiring like mercenaries and sellswords pretty much to go take care of stuff. Yeah. And it's like, man, if your government has to, drop to that, then you're in for a world of hurt.
One thing I thought was interesting is it's just this one throwaway line, but there's this implication that the Trade Federation has this droid army because that's kind of a loophole of how to get away from the idea that you're not supposed to have these like armies of people ready to fight for you. Mm-hmm. And so that was just kind of a cool little thing. Brian, is there anything else about Dooku that we can go so deep on all these characters, but either is there anything else you wanted to talk about, or Paul, you wanted to ask about Dooku before we move on to kind of the next big character?
Not really. I mean, it just explains that really the character you see, because you really only see him in Attack of the Clones, is that I think he became a Sith because of the ideology, not because of the things that you normally associate a Sith with. So at the end of the day, he was just doing it because it was the means to the end of getting to, a better galaxy. Right. Whereas most of the time you think of Sith, it's just the ultimate power and the.
Yeah, he doesn't have. Go ahead, Paul.
He kind of did it for the reason that Palpatine pretends he's doing everything.
Pretty much.
Yeah, sort of. He doesn't have a moment of like he's holding back his emotions and they all come flooding out. It's not rage and anger. I think it's much more about. There's a moment in the third season of the Clone Wars that I really love, where at that point Captain Tarkin is talking to Anakin about how the Republic is losing the Clone War in the Clone Wars in part because the Jedi sort of they fight with one hand tied behind their back. They try to fight with honor instead of just fighting to win. Yeah, and I think Dooku it's kind of like that. It's the I think the comparison you just made is perfect. What Sidious says about but there's things that the Force can do that a Jedi won't tell you. A Jedi will tell you are unnatural. Dooku is kind of like, let's go explore the unnatural stuff. It's almost it's this curiosity as well as this, I think, just a sense of he's just so he feels so cynical and jaded about the Jedi that he's like, it's kind of like that person who's been raised in a religion very, very like hardcore. Mm-hmm. And then the first time they're like, wait, maybe this isn't true. Okay, let me go do all the cool things the church told me all the time I shouldn't do because like screw them. I think that's very much where Dooku is.
Isn't that called Rumspringa?
Yeah,
pretty much.
Pretty much.
That from what I understand in the Legends canon, Luke kind of like uses whatever powers and sort of has a little bit of that mentality of like that something isn't necessarily like good or bad or light or dark. It's like how you use it, and I don't know. It sounds like a little similar, except that Dooku wanted to make the world fascist again or something, even if he didn't see that way. The thing though that seems odd to me is that if there weren't these big armies, then it like this idea of the entire galaxy being in war must have been kind of like super unusual, like a big aberration.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I think the idea until this point there were lots of little like border
like
skirmishes.
Battles between right,
but the idea of there being this like galactic war was pretty much unheard of.
Yeah, the last time they had it was however long ago. I think it was like probably 700-800 years ago, and that's when it was the Rusan Reformation, where they basically said they cut out the galactic army, so the army didn't have that ability to just go and basically impose their will on people or planets that they at their whim. So I still don't understand how there was never any question in Attack of the Clones when all of a sudden they show up with 1 million clones, and they're like, wait a second, where did all these come from? Seriously, ask a couple more questions.
Yeah, we got all these clones. Let's do a war, guys.
Yeah.
That part is still not quite explained as much, but at least we get some idea of where it comes from.
We'll ask about it after we win,
Okay. Yeah, right. So I guess the last Dooku question I would have is just in terms of time frame. So this whole book takes place before, like, it ends around the Phantom Menace. Is that correct?
It ends when, like, it ends.
It ends during the Phantom Menace. Like the last chapter is happening the night before the election that makes
Palpatine
right.
Chancellor.
And then there's actually a wonderful moment where you learn that just about the moment that Plagueis dies is almost the exact same moment that Darth Maul is killed, or we think is killed.
Right. Is behaved, or
besected, as it's referred to in one text of an episode.
Yeah.
So it is also kind of fun to get to watch, like, Plagueis and Sidious are talking to, every time, like, Sidious turns off the communicator with the Neomodians, you now have Plagueis and Sidious talking to each other about, like, oh no, this Gungan army is marching on Naboo, on Theed. Do we care about that? That kind of thing. So it's fun to see that whole thing play out from their perspective.
Right. Sort of like how the season 7 of the Clone Wars intersects with Revenge of the Sith.
Yeah. Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so.
So then Dooku he's left the Jedi like a couple years before the end of this book. But he's not.
No. He left the Jedi he basically leaves the Jedi in Phantom Menace, or right before that.
Okay.
It's the death of Qui-Gon Jinn that is the last straw for him, because one of the things that the book goes into is that if you remember, the opening scroll of Phantom Menace says, without any explanation, the Chancellor has secretly deployed 2 Jedi to try and solve the problem.
Right.
It turned out actually that because of stuff that's happened in the past, all that Plagueis and Sidious had orchestrated, the Chancellor wasn't supposed to do that anymore.
Right.
And so to Dooku, the fact that the Chancellor did it again, and that Qui-Gon, who was kind of like his favorite student because they argued all the time, like he loved him even though he, was like always...
Qui-Gon was Dooku's Padawan?
Yes.
Correct.
Okay.
And which is part of why Obi-Wan feels connected to him.
I see.
But it's Qui-Gon's death that is for Dooku the final. Well, I'm sorry, actually, it's 2 things. It's that, and it's the fact that they are agreeing to train Anakin, because Dooku, kind of like Yoda, just from a very different perspective, also thinks training Anakin is a horrible idea.
Right.
So there's so much more we could go into with Dooku there, but I think there's a good time to switch to Sidious. Let's talk more about Sidious. Obviously, he's the a main player in all the Star Wars movies. And Brian, what's your take on what we learn about Sheev Palpatine and Sidious in this? Because I just love getting to see more of his backstory. And I mean, he's still a huge mustache twirler in the original movies, but at least now we know so much more about where he comes from and why.
Okay, well, first off, I will never utter his first name. Even though the same author, James Luceno, was the one that gave him that first name in the Tarkin book, which is canon. I always thought that was because they make a point in this book why he calls himself Palpatine. He's eschewed his first name for his family name, even though he feels like an outsider because his whole family is a political power, and he's in a private school, and he's got a rich upbringing and stuff like that, but he really wants to do... Actually, I mean, at first, he was almost like when they show him as a youngster, when we first introduced to him, he's like 16 or 17, and he's an idealist. He has ideas for how he wants to help people and fix things. But at that same time, he also has this power that no one knows about. And, just to get before one of the final things at the end, when we find out that the whole time where Plagueis is manipulating Palpatine is manipulating Plagueis this whole time too, because he explains that on his deathbed. All these little things that he thought he was being manipulated by, he was actually manipulating Plagueis to it's like a double manipulation type thing.
Yeah. It's also, I think, a great case of an unreliable narrator, because I think certainly we're supposed to believe that Palpatine believed he was manipulating Plagueis the whole time.
Right.
And the question of who actually was manipulating who, I think, is somewhat left up to the reader, which I really like, because I think that makes, it's often very hard to be like, did I plant that idea for you? Did you want me to plant that idea for you? Like, I can always tell myself that I manipulated everybody into doing everything around me. Like, anyway,
Right. If the end result is what you wanted, then it seems like that it was all your doing to get there anyway.
Right. But why did you want that to begin with? It just can go deep and deep and deep. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's just really interesting to learn where he comes from in that regard, and that he has a huge chip on his shoulder in a lot of ways about who his identity is, about more than anything, it feels like he wants to be able to claim his own path. And I think one thing I like so much about him is that the relationship between the two of them really highlights what is this weird paradox at the heart of the Sith, which is that the whole idea of the Sith is complete radical. They are like, anarcho-libertarians to the absolute nth degree. Like, no one should ever get to tell me what to do.
Except.
And the only way that no one will ever tell me what to do is if I get to tell all of them what to do. So it's like, and there's this very strong idea from Plagueis of like, I will let you be in total control of yourself if you are utterly my slave first. And the conflict of that within Palpatine is a big part of, I think, what drives him. Like, that he wants all the things that Plagueis says the dark side offers, but that the path to get there is almost the exact opposite of everything he wants.
Right, and he does feel stifled a bit by it, because they that's what this book does a lot, where the first part ends and then there's two big time jumps, and all of a sudden after he starts training him, you find out that he's basically, because there's those scenes where it's like he puts him on a planet and he's like, your goal here is to literally survive, and if you don't use the Sith's power to survive and keep yourself warm, you will die. There's no doubt about that. So he's putting him basically through the worst, like, basic training you could possibly think of for like 10 years. So but in that same sense, Sidious is also feeling he's being, shortchanged the training, which is why he goes to Dathomir, where he gets basically given Maul to take care of. Which was just like, okay, that seemed kind of convenient, but then again, the Force works in a way where they probably sent him there because they were talking about, he went to Dathomir because of the witches and stuff like that, and he could figure he could learn more from them about different, because that was the thing. Plagueis kept mentioning to Palpatine that you can't rely on holocrons because that was from just the perspective of that one Sith, and a lot of Sith have
holocrons,
so many.
Those you don't know, are kind of like They're kind of like living textbooks where a Sith Lord would imbue a part of themselves into it, so if someone could find it, they could like...
Or Jedi, right?
Yeah, or Jedi. Yeah. Could commune with this thing and like learn from it. But yeah, as you're right, it's very limited because it's not... It is from a very particular subjective perspective.
Right. And when it comes to Sith ideology, it's just, there's such a wide gamut of it that something that is, gospel to one person to the next person is to be like, no. Not even close to that. This is what we want, which is, a setup for them to utterly fail anyway. But, that's why the Sith in the old didn't work when you had 10,000s of them, because everyone wanted to be in power, so they ended up basically, wiping themselves out, or at least Bane did, so. Right.
They were all backstabbing each other, and that's, I'd say one thing I think that I really like getting to see two Sith Lords interacting with each other throughout the book, in Plagueis and Sidious, because you see that you have two very different approaches to the Sith. Palpatine wants political power. And Plagueis wants him to have that, but he's much more you get to a point where you're sort of unsure, is Plagueis more interested in figuring out how to tear down the Jedi or in figuring out how to live forever? And he seems to be interested in both, but the second one, especially in the later half of the book, really kind of is everything he's focused on, his research into living beyond death and using the Force to live beyond death. And you can see that Sidious is frustrated by it because he's more about the dark side for political power. And I like that we get to see that you can be a Sith Lord and have a whole wide range of motivations, and there will be conflict because of that.
And one other cool thing that they brought up, which didn't come to fruition, is that part of this whole process at the end was to make Higo Damask, which is Plagueis, Palpatine was supposed to make him the co-chancellor, so they could both rule together that way, so they would actually be hiding in plain sight. And once he got elected, he was just like, yeah, I don't need you, and that's when he killed him. Yeah. So Plagueis did have political aspirations in that sense, but he was piggybacking onto it. So It wasn't like he was just, he was focused. His main focus was with all the, that's another thing. He's got a planet and a lair pretty much that is just like the island of Dr. Moreau gone wild.
For anybody who's played Vampire the Masquerade, Plagueis is 100% a La Sombra. Like, that's exactly the kind of role he
I was thinking Tenebris was more likely to be with Obtenebration, but...
Also possible, yeah.
They're from the same clan in some ways. But...
Tenebris is kind of like scientist Sith. He's a kind of really fascinating, like, he's all about, like, mathematical formulas and he's almost kind of a Order of Hermes. To take the White Wolf game metaphors way too far.
Although it sounds kind of Son of Ether.
One thing I think I also really love... No, the Hermes, because it's all about... Yeah, I guess...
I was going to make a Menzo Baranzan reference earlier, so...
now
with regard to the Sith.
The other thing I think is really interesting, and again, it helps fill in a plot hole, is... One of the things that Plagueis is interested in, and Sidious sort of is, but sort of isn't, is saying that we no longer need the rule of two. Which is both, part of the idea is that we're getting to a point where the Sith are going to take over, and so they don't have to hide anymore. Mm-hmm. But it also is a very nice way of fixing a plot hole, which is that they kind of get the rule of two, and then they're kept being more and more and more and more. And so it's nice that they're sort of like, nope, that wasn't a plot hole. Okay, there's a reason why the Death Star is so easy to blow up if you know the plans, you know?
Exactly.
Well, and that thing, too, is that they never really... It's the whole Star Wars certain point of view thing, because when Plagueis kills Tenebris and then he finds Venomous, which was he gave himself the Darth title, but he's like, no, there's only two of us, but he still wanted him. He goes, yeah, we're going to break it down, but you could also have, someone as like an assassin, sort of like how Dooku had Ventress.
Yeah.
Plagueis knew that Palpatine had Maul.
Right.
But he was training him to do his dirty work and stuff like that, not realizing he was grooming him to take over because, the whole Sith thing is one to have the power, the other to crave it, and the only way you succeed as the apprentice is to kill the master.
Right. And that part of what the master is supposed to do, therefore, is to kind of have multiple apprentices all kind of competing with each other to be the one true apprentice.
The rule of 2+.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's kind of fun is at one point you're getting inside Sidious's head, and... as he's recruiting Dooku, he's already met Anakin. And he knows from the beginning, Anakin is like endgame. Dooku is like, I'm going to date you, I'm not going to marry you. But it's very clear. I think he describes at one point Dooku as a placeholder. Dooku will be a good apprentice, in part because Dooku will be the one who Anakin can kill to kind of cement his role. Right. And it's fun, too, because early on, Plagueis and Sidious both think that the worst thing that could happen is for the Jedi to train Anakin. Plagueis especially, and here's
the
where
worst thing for the Jedi. Or the worst thing for them.
The worst thing for them is if the Jedi train Anakin.
Oh, okay.
One of the things I think that's really interesting is that, in some ways, Sidious is Sidious is a little more insidious.
Yes.
He has Plagueis wants to train a clone army to fight the Jedi. And then Sidious is the one to suggest, wait a minute, what if we make the Jedi in charge of the clone army? How much will it screw with them?
Right.
And in the same way, I think Plagueis thinks that for the Jedi to train Anakin would be a disaster, and that's part of why Maul gets sent to try and kill them. And it's Sidious who realizes that and there's this great closing monologue that really just lays out everything that happens in the prequels. Sidious realizes that he already can sense the anger in Anakin, the fact that Anakin's hiding things from Obi-Wan, even at 8 years old.
Yeah.
There's a fun scene where Palpatine asks Anakin about his mother, and Obi-Wan says, no, he's not allowed to think about his mother. There's no more attachments. And
Obi-Wan.
And Palpatine can sense the fury within 8-year-old. Yeah, exactly. It's so dumb. But and it's just a brilliant thing of him realizing, actually the best way to make sure that Anakin doesn't become a Jedi is to give him to the Jedi for 10 years.
Right.
Let him do all the hard. Let them do all the hard part of it.
Right.
Yeah. Show him firsthand why they're not what they're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I have two questions then.
Go for it.
One is very specific, Revenge of the Sithy, where it is okay. Where Anakin's about to kill Dooku, and Dooku's there, and Sidious is there, and Dooku's not like, hey, by the way.
Yeah.
Like, is there much light shed on that? Like, why he doesn't give him up, basically?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not in this book, yeah. I mean, they really don't even talk about that. That was always sort of like look at him like, wait, what do you, because Dooku even gives Palpatine that look in the movie like, wait, what are you telling him?
He's like, bro.
Wait, stop. I thought this was all right. We got the three of us here now. We're good. He's like, nah.
I think the answer is because he just doesn't have time, because he thinks up until that last moment that, especially because there is this implication that the rule of two is broken, that it's going to be a nice happy family of Dooku, Anakin, and Palpatine. And then when Palpatine goes kill him, Dooku's like, what? And then he's dead.
Okay. But, I don't buy it, but I buy it. I buy it as a sufficient headcanoning.
That's fair, yeah.
But it's in the same category as Mace Windu taking the big backswing.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
To be like, oh, hey, Anakin, could you chop my hand off before I manage to bring my lightsaber down on Sidious?
And I'll even hold it here for you, too. So.
Right. And then the second question, which is less specific and more, it's just... Does the book make Sidious feel not just like kind of understandable, but like does it make him relatable? Does it seek to do that?
I think it.
I'm trying to think, because basically, I mean, if you were to name this book, the first two chapters were definitely Darth Plagueis. The third part was a lot more focused on Sidious. That's when they started giving him the narrator perspective of it. Okay. You get to learn more about him and his. Basically, he does have these. This was all planned out between the two of them, but a lot of it was they were Plagueis and Sidious did, argue a lot about stuff, and just the way that they wanted to get to the end point, it makes Palpatine seem a lot more of a sinister and like a credible threat, because he is a master manipulator. Like he just won't shoot you to death with Force lightning, but he can sit there and make you do stuff. And that's how we pretty much got Anakin to become Anakin, become Vader.
And I think to answer your question, it's hard to say because of the sort of final reveal that Palpatine does about how he's been manipulating Plagueis the whole time. I think the character that Palpatine presents himself to Plagueis as is very much relatable, I think, because one thing you find out is basically like, think of the story of like the 17-year-old boy who's angry at his dad, and then along comes someone else who's like, oh, you're angry at your dad? You should kill him. I'll help you hide your body. Like, I'll help you like that. Like,
right.
That's kind of like a villain origin story where you're both like, wow, this is a monster, but I also feel bad for this very like fucked up kid who this awful person came along and turned into a monster.
Right.
And I think that version of Plagueis, of Palpatine, is very relatable.
Okay.
Towards
like
the end,
Kingpin-ish? Like...
Not quite
that much.
Because he's not like an abused kid, but there is definitely a sense more it's like, Dad, can I borrow the keys to the car? No, I'm pissed at you. Now I'm going to kill you, kind of thing.
Oh yeah, okay, well.
The scene they show. Okay, so basically, in the first part of it, Plagueis and Palpatine start a friendship. He's in the youth program, and Palpatine's dad wants nothing to do with those two being together because he thinks he's a bad influence on him. And
not totally wrong.
No, exactly.
Just got to stick up for the dad here on that behalf.
But the scene where they're on their starship and Palpatine basically just unleashes hell and kills his whole family is sort of a reaction to him and his dad having this big blowout because he wants to take him off the planet and send him somewhere else to go under a different advisor and stuff like that. And he's like, stop trying to run my life. And so when they're on that spaceship, which was all manipulated by putting them seeing Plagueis did it, And then when he comes back, the first thing Palpatine does is contacts Plagueis and be like, it's almost like the Anakin coming to Padme and be like, what have I done?
Yeah.
Right.
And he puts him in, he basically says, here, wait for me to come and get you and we'll figure this all out. But I mean, yeah, he basically kills everyone in his family.
Yeah. And so I guess the way I would answer your question, Paul, is, again, it goes to the kind of question of how relatable a narrator Palpatine is. Because if
how
Palpatine...
reliable?
Yeah, how reliable.
Yeah,
well, yeah, how reliable affects how relatable. Because basically, if he is reliable and he is correct that he was always in control, he was never being manipulated, then I feel like he's just such a force of evil that I don't feel much sympathy or relation to him.
Okay.
The version of it that I read, though, and Brian, I'm curious if you saw it very differently, is, I've definitely seen situations, I've done this, I've known lots of people who do this, who... It's very easy to headcanon your own story and come up with no, I was never being manipulated. I always wanted to do that. And in some ways, the way that Sidious is after all the things Plagueis does to him, I can understand Sidious kind of telling himself that story. And so in that regard, I very much can find him a not sympathetic, but relatable character of that, he was treated these horrible ways. He's become this horrible person. And he's telling himself this story about how he's always been in power because it's how he can, claim back that control over himself.
That's how he wants to see himself.
Exactly. And then I'm like, okay, cool. Now we've got a relatable human character who's not just twirling a mustache.
Relatable, but unreliable.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
I think it started off with...
He's in the spirit of the truth, to quote us.
I think it was it could be sort of like two sides of the same coin, where it was Palpatine was brought this way. I mean, Plagueis pushed him, got him over that edge, and then at some point, Palpatine realized what was going on and then started playing the game back. I mean, I don't think he was doing it the whole time. There's no way that he was doing this the whole time, because he didn't know that Plagueis was a Sith at first until after. I mean, he didn't even recruit him until after he got him to kill his parents. Then he realized, oh, by the way, I'm a Sith, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to train you. And then literally that's when they jumped the 11 years. But at some point, I think Palpatine did become, he turned the tables on him and said, this is what we're going to do now, and I'm going to make it seem like you're doing it to me, but the end result is going to be me getting what I want.
Right.
And I think that's in some ways, it feels like it's a very Sith kind of a story of you get so used to being in power and being in control that you kind of stop, you don't recognize when you're losing it, and that's, Palpatine does that with Vader, Plagueis did that with Palpatine. I think that's very much a part of how the Sith dynamic can often turn out.
Exactly.
I think Sidious and Dooku were the two big ones I wanted to talk about, but there's a few other things to touch on. Paul, do you have any other questions about Sidious, or Brian, any other things from this book you wanted to mention?
I'm good.
No, I think it pretty much strengthens the case that this guy was just evil.
Yeah.
That was it.
Okay. So it's not like Dexter, basically, where,
No.
It's like... He's not going around killing people that are bad. It's like he clearly is up to no good, and there's some somewhat relatable how he got to that point, but still not a good guy.
There's not
a certain point of view.
No, there's not a single redemption arc out there for Palpatine whatsoever. Okay. On any multiverse plane, whatever.
I'm good
no
with
way.
that.
He's evil.
And I think a good way to actually better explain that is to transition to the next one I want to talk about, which is Naboo and the Trade Federation, because part of Sidious's rise comes in his role in the early sort of machinations that lead to Naboo and the Trade Federation, because, and again, the machinations go pretty deep. I don't want to go into all of it, but the base idea of it is it's kind of a story of colonial exploitation. That Naboo is kind of a, not a developing world, but it's a small planet that has some economic value, is not super important, but it's discovered that it has this huge, set of natural resources of plasma that the world needs. So it's kind of like, when the small country that no one cared about, people discover gold or oil or uranium or whatever it is. And so there's all this political machinations going back and forth over what should happen. And there's a big faction saying, Naboo for the Nabooians. We don't want these outsiders coming in to colonialize us and to, help us develop our natural resources while they get all the money.
Right.
And Palpatine's father is one of the ones who's most against the outsiders coming in.
Oh.
And Palpatine, like, basically a big part of his early story is helping Plagueis, who's with the banking clan, one of the people who wants to exploit Naboo. So he basically, it's not like he's sort of the local leader who gets corrupted. From the beginning, he's sort of like, oh, okay, I can use this as a path to power, to sell out my own planet and to, use this to come to political glory. And if you like politics especially, it's a very interesting story of how he sort of helps him and Plagueis together, like, play these different sides off against each other in a story of, like, how do you deal with colonial exploitation?
So how did Sidious? I do have one more Sidious question. How did he end up being so racist? Right? Because wasn't the Empire very, like, anti-non-human and like or speciesist?
No, it was definitely xenophobic. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think they don't get into that as much because it almost have to imply, because they do talk about him with, like, Masamita is Chagrian, and then like all the people around him are not human pretty much, except for his imperial dignitaries.
Right.
I think that you probably use that as more of a thing back in the 70s when were making Star Wars and that, because it was a lot easier to just have humans around.
Right, that's fair.
Yeah, my understanding of how this story went was that, as Brian said, like, the Empire was all humans because that's what's easiest.
Right.
Eventually, in the early part of the Legends canon, they wrote in the story of the Empire being very, like, humans only.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of in later years, they kind of let that aspect of the story drop. Okay. And it's why it isn't mentioned very often anymore. And it just is never mentioned in this. I mean, certainly he sees the Gungans as subhuman, but he never feels negatively about Plagueis for being non-human or anything like that.
Right. If
anything, Plagueis himself is, the Muns are probably more racist towards humans than Sidious and the humans are towards anybody else.
And they're different from the Trade Federation people?
Yeah, those are Nemoidians.
Okay.
Yeah, they're the they only very briefly appear in the prequels, but they appear somewhat in the Clone Wars. They're kind of bluish, very thin, like very long, thin faces.
Their heads almost look like they look like the Easter Island statues.
Right, yeah. I know who you're talking about. I just wanted to verify that they were different from the extremely racist portrayal of the Trade Federation.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
These are more like Germanic than they are Asiatic, the way the or Asian
Trade Federation.
An Asian racist, the way the Trade Federation.
Yeah. Fair.
But yeah, so I just thought that was a fun little part of the story as well, is to get a better idea of what's been happening with Naboo. Is that it's just this back and forth discussion over who,
resources.
First resources there, and then the taxation of how the resources get in and out, and that's where what the exact connection is between the taxation of the routes and how it connects to the colonial part of it isn't exact. It's kind of hand waved a little bit, but we're fine with that.
It had more to do with the fact is that they had. The Trade Federation got pretty much the exclusive rights to get the plasma out of Naboo. And that's why they had a presence there to begin with. And then later on in the story, when it was closer to the Phantom Menace time, these trade routes were free. And so it was beneficial to the Trade Federation because they were pretty much getting a cut of the people using the routes because that's what the Trade Federation does. But if they start taxing them, then less people are going to use them because the taxes were going to go to the government because I forgot what it was. If they were using it for something, they needed to get more money for, I think, for like the defense of some planet.
I think to sort of start helping with one of the other problems that had come up.
Right.
It's definitely a situation where like they kind of create a perfect storm of, Plagueis is just lighting these little fires all over the place that makes it too much for the public to take care of. The one other thing I think is a nice part about the way that part of the story plays out is sometimes it can be frustrating to tell a whole story and then realize at the end that there's someone like maniacally laughing and rubbing their hands, which means that everything that just happened played into their hands, and so it sort of doesn't matter.
Yeah.
One thing that made clear is like everything that happens in Phantom Menace isn't like exactly as Sidious foresaw it. You know,
okay.
he thought that
It's not
Queen
all of
Amidala
her plan.
would just sign the treaty, and then he thought that
Right.
she would. And there's kind of this great like set of back and forth of Plagueis and Sidious being like, "Oh, okay, well the Federation fucked up that plan. Let's do the next one. Let's do the
Right.
next
Oh
one.
yeah,
Let's do the
especially
next
with
one."
especially with
They've
Valorum,
gotta
like you said,
improvise.
sending the Jedi to Naboo to broker the peace because of the invasion or the occupation. That wasn't part of their plan. So that's when like, crap, how do we get this out of it?
Yeah.
So a lot of the stuff was, they worked their way around it, but it was not all their grand plan was 100% effective.
Right. And I just like that because it makes Queen Amidala and like what happens in The Force Awakens seem kind of a little bit more like, okay, this has some relevance. It's not just
The Phantom
everything.
Menace?
Isn't that what I said? Did I say The Force Awakens?
You said
Yeah,
The Force
yeah.
Awakens.
I'm not attempting to correct. I'm attempting to clarify. Well, I guess
no.
correct, but like just so that, so we all know
Yep. No, I have
that you meant what we thought you meant, but now we're certain.
Listeners, there's nothing in this book that pertains to the sequels at all.
Awakens.
We're not quite there yet in any of the
Yep.
storytelling. So
Exactly. There's no grand unifying theory of that quite yet. But yeah, so I think that gives us most of what's important about Naboo. I think that it is kind of fun to see a little bit more of the politics of Naboo and how all that happens. And there is also some extent to which, in part because they want her to be easily manipulated, Sidious pulls some strings and creates a situation in which a 13-year-old girl gets elected as queen. Because again, I think that was one of the some people were like, wait, this country elected a 13-year-old girl as their queen? How does that happen? So it is at least fun.
I mean, starting with electing a queen, but
also a thing. But like
they explained how it went from hierarchical to a position that stayed the same title, but it just became electorate.
Yeah. There's just a lot of little details like that where it's like, okay, that thing that seems kind of dumb, here's a kind of plausible explanation for it.
Right. Yeah, okay.
There's a lot of that in this book with the prequels where it says, okay, this is, okay, I guess that explains that.
Yep. The one other thing I think is interesting there is also that, what was I going to say? I was thinking about the Trade Federation, the Amodians.
I mean, they're just as dumb in this book as they are in the prequels.
Okay.
They're just so, they want so much power and stuff that Newt Gunray and those guys are just like, yeah, whatever. Like, they're suspicious, but they never once think that, okay, if this is going to help us, let's do it.
Oh, I remember. The one thing I wanted to point out as well is that, because again, something that's talked about from the book is like, well, if the Sith are supposed to be hiding for so long, why does Maul just, break out the red lightsaber all of a sudden? And then actually, Plagueis and Sidious had talked quite a while about this is the moment when we'll finally sort of like reveal ourselves. And that's very intentional, which is another thing that I really appreciate and really, really liked. And in Phantom Menace, they meant, like Darth Maul says, like, finally we'll reveal ourselves. But it's nice to see, like, why is this moment so important to them and why does it matter?
Right.
But
that's gone a long time without in the shadows, basically.
Right. Yeah,
and that's a cool part of this book too, because they actually go into that whole balcony scene because Darth Plagueis is eavesdropping on him. When he hears that, he's sort of just going like, "What? Wait a second, what's going on here?" Like he feels like he's being betrayed, but he's like, well, at the end of the day, it's going to help our, it's going to help our plan come to, fruition. But really, his downfall is coming within a day or so.
Right. So I think there are two other things I want to talk about that got revealed about in this book, and the next is the dark side itself. And we've talked some about it, but Brian, what do you feel like we learn about the dark side and the Sith and how they function in this larger galaxy from this book?
I'd say function is a loose word to use as far as how the Sith work, because, like I said, it always just seems like when you're bickering with someone like your brother and you do something that he wanted done anyway, but it wasn't the way he did it, he'll still find fault with, the way it got done because it wasn't his idea. So there's a lot of that going on where it's just, you feed off of the negativity and it's kind of weird because those Plagueis and Sidious seem like a really odd couple because they have such different like end goals, it seems. I mean, Plagueis is basically a man of science. He wants to live forever. And Sidious wants to, change the way the galaxy is run and basically, wipe the slate clean. But since they're both Sith, they're the ones that are able to, manipulate it and do the stuff. But as far as like the Sith go, it basically just shows that they do what needs to be done, regardless of the cost, as long as it, propels their agenda going, which we pretty much knew about them already.
Yeah. I think more than anything for me, it breaks this idea of that it's all one sort of unified plan, and that, stretching back to Bane, that they always have the same idea, and that it's individuals, and that it's the whole point is like be ruled by your passions. And so every master is going to be different, and every master is going to have different passions. And especially because, a big part of it is that Plagueis does have this near-death experience where he almost gets killed by assassins, and he really hides. He kind of turns inward and just kind of becomes a recluse, really focusing now on his experiments with the Force and his ability to use the Force to both prolong life and to create life. There's this whole, he really delves into this idea of the Force kind of pushing back on things, and it's an idea that I kind of wish was explored more, but it's that idea of the flip side of Qui-Gon Jinn with the living Force, that there's a lot of times where he talks about, I did this terrible thing now happen because it was the Force pushing back, or the Force saying it's not time yet, or that it is ready.
Paradox.
Exactly, yeah. The paradox from Mage the Ascension is very much the idea. There's a moment in the books where Plagueis very much believes, and Sidious does too, that they basically have done this kind of mystical ritual that has pushed the balance of the Force over to the dark side. And I think the implication is here, and it's all done very vaguely, but that it's about the moment where they've sort of put the energy out into the world that creates Anakin.
Right.
And so there's also the whole question of how to, some point someone's going to tell me the story of the prophecy to some satisfaction, because it still has never been done and this book doesn't do it. But it's one more interesting, one more part of the whole, what is this prophecy all about?
Yeah, right. Doesn't balance usually mean two sides equal to each other? Where in the prophecy of the Force is all Jedi, no Sith. That's not balance. Yeah. That's really lopsided.
Right. Yeah, balance, it's if there's supposed to be two Sith, and you're going for balance, and there's a bunch of you, this doesn't sound like a good deal for you.
I mean, if there'd always been 10,000 Jedi, well, at least for the last 1,000 years, if there'd been 1,000 Jedi and two Sith, and now there's two Sith and Yoda and Obi-Wan, then we're kind of balanced again. That's 2 and 2.
Yeah, so he did bring his
Exactly, there was balance.
so Palpatine brought balance.
For a hot minute.
But like you brought up too, with that whole thing with the manipulation when they put it out, that's where later on, when Anakin is introduced to Palpatine and he does the time frame in his mind, and he's like, oh crap, that was about that time. But it's one of two things. A, yes, that was their byproduct of what they did, or B, the Force recognized that and kicked it back and said, no, we're going to do this.
Right.
So it's sort of just it's one of those, it's one or the other. It has to be, because they pretty much have already explained that it was an immaculate conception. So unless Shmi is just lying, and at the end it was just all coincidence.
Yeah.
I mean, this would also though make Anakin effectively sort of Palpatine's kid, which then makes Ben Solo and Rey cousins. So that keeps with the Star Wars theme.
Well. Yeah. It's definitely why I think a lot of people have taken the idea from this that Plagueis basically impregnates Anakin's mother and taken it in a very dark direction of that it's basically a forcible, impregnation with all the sort of connotations that has, all of which I think are horrific.
Which are bad.
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically a force rape.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
And I think there's a way to read the book that way. I think it is intentionally a lot more subtle than that. And certainly...
Or vague.
Yeah.
Uncertain, right? It sounds uncertain.
It's uncertain, and it's also a couple of steps removed, because definitely there's no implication that anyone was okay, that person on Tatooine, we're going to wave our magic wands and make her pregnant.
Right.
It's much more this sort of putting out a force into the universe. And I think what Brian is saying is what I think the books more kind of imply is that it's more that because they did so much to sort of cause there to be this emblematicness of dark force energy in the world, that then the Force was okay, well, we need some balance. Hey, you're going to carry this child, which is itself also still horribly problematic and broken.
Just why?
It's someone else causing the Force rape.
It makes the more sense with the second part, because they did dig in a couple of times when they were talking with the cloners, saying that no matter what they did, you can't replicate or introduce the force sensitivity in anything. So if that was the case, that unless something was a freak of nature when they did it, it would have had to have been the force saying, no, see, you guys can't do this. We can do it. But you can't create life with the force. The force can only do that.
Right.
But then again, it's still that everything. It's like watching the movie Donnie Darko. You have no idea it's up to your own interpretation.
Yeah, at this point we get very much into how many Force angels can dance on the head of a pin, and it gets pretty confusing.
I definitely feel like the less I know about the Force, the more interesting I find it.
That's very legitimate.
And the more like explanation is offered, kind of the more I'm like,
yeah.
But
I forget what it is, but there's one version of a story that I've seen. I think it might be somewhere in canon, but it may well be just from legends or just like headcanon stuff that's been created. But it's basically the idea of like that part of the fall of the Jedi is when they lose the mysticism of the Force and start thinking they can like scientifically quantify the Force, and that like, yes, there are these things called midichlorians, but they don't really matter, and that part of the Jedi mistake was becoming too into the like, oh look, we understand the Force, it's the science, instead of remembering it's this unspeakable mystery that's supposed to be beyond comprehension. And I really like that. Which the same reason you're talking about, Paul, because it's like if the Force becomes something that is like quantifiable, then now it's a role-playing mechanic. It's not a mystery that drives an epic story.
Right. I mean, like in real life, I'm not really all that interested in the idea that there are unquantifiable, unknowable things, or that we can know that something is unquantifiable and unknowable. Mm-hmm. But like within the context of the story, I find that efforts to quantify it or to not make it like these people are trying to have this understanding of this,
right?
But as a storyteller, I'm not going to necessarily tell you whether they're right or not. To like go to like a very brief Vampire the Masquerade reference, the idea that all these vampires come from Cain never really appealed to me. The idea that all these vampires think they came from Cain, I thought was very interesting. Yeah. But like leaving that in some sort of mystery and being like, well, this is the mythology, here's the mythology of the Force, and we know that people can do these things using it, but there's still some element of mystery, and you can kind of headcanon it whichever way you want. I find a lot more appealing. I mean, in general, just I find stories that ask questions a little more appealing than ones that are like, this is the answer. I mean, some answers cool, but leaving some room for interpretation. And it sounds like they did that to some extent, which I think sounds very cool.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it. I think it really introduces the idea of it being an unreliable narrator, instead of the Qui-Gon Jinn, like, giving Anakin a shot, lying to him, by the way, about why he does it. Don't lie to kids, Qui-Gon. Not cool. But like, and being like, oh, he has midichlorians, blah, blah, blah. Like, reintroducing the idea of like, that's just what we humans understand. Like, there's a whole mystery there that's beyond it. I understand why for you there's no interest in the religious side of it. For me, as a person of faith, that really does speak to me, because basically to me, like, what it's kind of saying is like the Jedi become fundamentalists. It's the idea of like, you can quantify God. You can say like, God exists in this building and not that building, or by these magic words or not that magic words. Every religion has like, most religions can have some element of that like fundamentalist nature, and the more temporal power a religion has, I think often it can go that direction. And so I think the idea that the Jedi do it too, it makes total sense. So
yeah, I like that as the Jedi being a religion and being recognized as that within the world. Basically.
Exactly. Yeah, it just makes more interesting storytelling, and it once again, I think it cleans up part of the prequels in a way that I really like.
A part of the prequels.
Yes. Nothing will fix sand. There's no amount of headcanon that will ever. Actually, no. I'll put that out here, fans. If you, I am willing to read these short stories. If you can write a short story that gives the backstory and helps me understand why I hate sand works as a line in that context, I will bring you on this podcast to have you read that story and like give you mass adulation and give you some free merchandise. I'm putting out that challenge. If you can make it happen, do it. I can't imagine how many bad short stories I'm about to read, but hopefully, still, it's great user interaction. And I'm wrong. Maybe you all are great writers. Maybe there's a way to do it. I think even a great writer can't do it, but I'm putting the challenge out there.
I do think it's almost worth it, though, for the Rey and Anakin meme, where they both are complaining about sand. I think that was pretty good. Generally, things that are unsalvageable are only salvageable by memes.
So I do think it's a good time to start wrapping up. Brian, do you have any other kind of last comments or thoughts about the book you wanted to bring up?
There was one thing which actually I forgot about until I read it this time, where they were talking at the end, and there was a bunch of Jedi, and they brought up Jedi Master Jorah Sabaoth, who is the main bad guy in the heir to his clone is the main bad guy into the original Thrawn novels. And I'm like, oh, I totally forgot he was in this book.
Yeah, that's just a fun little name drop. It's not relevant to anything, but it's a fun little Easter egg for a character in another set of novels we'll definitely be talking about at some point soon.
Right. But besides that, I hope they don't do anything deliberately to knock this out of being what actually happened, because I think it works for this time period. Yeah. So, I think if you're listening, Disney, don't fuck with it.
I think that's true. And I imagine that it's a period of time that they're not planning to explore anytime soon, so I don't feel like there's any need why they would have to. The High Republic books are going to end with a show called The Acolyte, which is set... It's basically about a new Sith person coming along around about the time of Darth Tenebrous would maybe have been, because I think that is going to be set maybe about 30 years before this book starts. So
exactly, yeah, because they said about 100 BBY, and this book starts at 67 BBY, so that's about 30.
So it might be fun if, like, in the last season of that, we meet Plagueis or something like that. Like, if there's some connection there, but or even Tenebrous, but I don't think we're going to get anything beyond that, and I'm fine with that. I'm happy to let this.
The one thing in my head, though, is that both Tenebrous and Venomous are Bith Sith, and if you know what a Bith is, those are the modal nodes, the band players from the Mos Eisley Cantina. Oh yeah. So if you imagine seeing that as they're not very menacing looking, other than their big black eyes, but those are the Sith Lords. Yeah. So it's sort of like, I guess it would be imagined like seeing like Meeber Gascon from the Clone Wars as being a Sith Lord, this little like 1 foot tall amphibian looking thing.
Hey, listen, anyone can be scary, you can make it happen. Oh, Paul, thank you so much for being our kind of, man on the street for this episode. Any other last questions you have, or just kind of what are your thoughts on after all you've heard about this?
It's pronounced Agent of Chaos.
Chaos Agent.
No, it was fun. I was happy to join and kind of ask the questions so other people don't have to. Although they can still ask questions, lots of questions. I'm sure there's lots of questions people still have. So we love nothing more than conversation or something. I don't know. You love conversation. I like conversation with a small number of people. So you do all those tweeting and Facebook things.
Exactly.
But yeah, it was a lot of fun. I was happy to ask some questions and get some answers, and we'll see you next time.
Well, Paul is apparently being not only our agent of chaos, but also our resident misanthrope. Also our resident misanthrope. Yes. But Paul, on those few times when you do want to talk to people, you are pretty responsive. So if people want to find more of your writings or thoughts on the internet, where can they find those?
ZenMadman.com, at Twitch, at Twitter, at whatever other social medias I haven't quit yet.
Awesome. And yourself, Brian, if people want to find, I know you talk about Star Wars in a couple other places as well as other great things. Where can people find more of your stuff?
I'm part of I got a podcast on the Rebel Force Radio Network called the Babu Freaks. We just released our 9th episode yesterday, and we talk about Star Wars and stuff. I'm one of the moderators on the Stranded Panda chat board, so I'm there a lot. So we talk about everything there anyway, so it's a good conversation. It's a good place to go to talk about it.
Definitely. Yeah. Definitely check out Brian and Paul's work. They do a lot of other great stuff. As Brian mentioned, Brian mentioned the Stranded Panda chat. This podcast is a proud part of the Stranded Panda Podcast Network. There you can find other podcasts about ethical discussions, also deep dives into other universes like Star Trek, the MCU, DC, all sorts of great stuff. Definitely check those out. Definitely join in the conversations. And the other thing is, if you want to support this podcast, I've recently launched or relaunched our Patreon. You can find it as, if you go to Patreon, if you search for The Ethical Panda, you should find it. But the best way is if you go to my website, theethicalpanda.com, and click on support. There will be the link for our Patreon. Any support you can give is great. It's going to help make this episode, help make this podcast happen, as well as you can get things like advertiser free. You can get copies of the podcasts without any advertisements directly. At a certain level, you can get outtakes, which among other things, you'll hear all the different ways I say the wrong thing. Because I'm very known for, I know exactly what I'm talking about, but I'll call the movie by the wrong name.
That's worth your patronage right
exactly,
there.
Listen, Bob, I get...
It's like, is it Plagueis or Plagueis? I actually looked it up, but...
It's, if you remember, it's like the plague.
In the movie, he says
like
Plagueis.
It's like the plague.
Yeah, Plagueis.
Yeah.
But yeah, it can be Plagueis, it can be Plagueis. All that stuff, and even at the highest levels of Patreon support, you can get free merchandise or even the chance to help us design an episode. So definitely go to patreon.com, drop us some support, go to strandedpanda.com, support all the other great podcasts. Let us know what you think, and have a great day.